Right, so good afternoon, folks. We're going to take a little break from the sort of game Volcano Island stuff that we're working on so that we can talk about the particle systems. This is something that we can, of course, incorporate then next week when we get back to doing some programming stuff. Nick, the last Zoom recording, I thought I had, but I'll make sure to check that one. It should be available. If I haven't, then I will make sure that it is at the end of class today. Okay, particle systems are essentially where you get your sort of interesting effects. There's two different types that Unity sort of deals with, and they're sort of very different in the way that they can interact with the rest of your game and the system that's used to create them. So we're going to look at just the basic particle system today. This is a CPU particle system. So all of the memory related to the particle system is all on your RAM, on your system, and the calculations to move the particles around and do whatever they're doing is done by the CPU. On Thursday, we're going to look at the VFX graph. Those are GPU particles. So all of the data related to them is on the GPU, all the calculations happen on the GPU. The big difference between them is the number of particles that you can deal with. So the standard sort of Unity particle system, you're looking at maybe thousands, tens of thousands, depending on what you're doing with the particles, as sort of a limiting number. You still have all your other stuff happening in your game, so you don't want to have hundreds of thousands or millions of CPU particles, because that's going to really slow down your game, your frame rate, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the GPU particles, you can have millions or tens of millions of those and not have a big impact on your game. However, they can have less impact on your actual other systems of your game as the game is playing. So CPU particles can interact and collide with things, for instance. Whereas the GPU particles, that becomes either not possible in certain situations or sort of much more difficult to achieve. So there are situations where you would use one or the other. We're going to look at both. The VFX graph is very different in terms of how you actually go about creating your particle systems, but you can come up with some really cool effects, and we're going to do sort of a ring of sort of sparks that looks like it's sort of twirling around and stuff with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of particles, whereas the regular Unity particle system wouldn't be able to do that. So a lot of today, there's not a whole lot of slides. If you're looking at the lecture slides or something, there's not a whole lot of them. I'm going to show you some of the pieces, and for the most part, you sort of mess around with the stuff. So I'll give you sort of an indication on how to create or how to use a material, so you can get sort of a graphic for a sprite, stuff like that today, a graphic for each individual particles. And really, it's messing around with it. It's looking at a game and saying, hey, can I recreate that? Can I recreate that effect? And then trying to go and see what settings you can do and various colors and speed over lifetime and size over lifetime. We're going to look at a bunch of these individual sort of particle modules. So in Unity, a particle system is just a component, just like everything else. It's a component that you add to a game object. For certain types of effects, like explosions or some sort of death effect or something, typically you will add it to just a standard game object. So you create an empty game object, add a particle system to it. And then you can make it a prefab, just like what we did with the enemy. We can make it a prefab, and then we can instantiate it whenever we need to. So same thing with a particle system. You can instantiate it, and then the particle system will play. So whether it's an explosion or something else, sparks from a computer console or something in your game, you instantiate it and it can play. Typically, you're going to create a single game object for each particle system. And then, as I said, instantiate the object. You might have it be a child to another object. So one of the things that we'll likely do in the Volcano Island game is we'll create a particle system for sort of melting or sort of sweating off of little sort of droplet-looking particles off of the snowman itself. In that case, the particle system would be a child of the player object so that it would move around with it and sort of stick with it. So oftentimes you either instantiate it separately or attach it as a child to another object and then start it playing through code. So we'll look at a little bit of that this time and then tomorrow. So like I said, it's mostly about playing around with settings, trying to reproduce different effects. There's way too many options and settings to explore all of them. And for the most part, some of them you're not going to use very often, so it's not necessarily worth going over all of them unless you specifically need some sort of set of sort of effects or movement of your particles or something. So we're going to look at some of the common ones, some of the more useful ones, and then we're really going to do sort of two things. We're going to do a very basic particle system and then a more complicated one as well today. All right, so pretty much any visual effect that you see in games, things like fire, smoke, all that kind of stuff, sparks, even weapons fire, they are very possibly particle systems. There's tons and tons of tutorials out there. Some of them might be a little bit old compared to where Unity is now, but they are worth going and taking a look at. If nothing else, just to see the settings that were used to create them. So we'll start with that basic system, and then we're going to reproduce a partial effect from an actual game. So we're going to start with just a basic 3D Unity project. On Thursday, we're actually going to use the HDRP, so we'll talk more about that on Thursday. But if you want to start with just a brand new project for this, if I open up the Unity Hub, I already have a basic 3D one set up, but if I go to new, I can just select the one here, 3D. So there's a few others. Obviously, there's 2D. There's not really any difference between 3D and 2D, other than a couple settings that are changed that you can switch between. There's 3D with extras. There's high definition render pipeline and universal render pipeline. So we will use the HDRP on Thursday, but for now, we just need the basic 3D project. That shouldn't take too long to load up either. If you create an HDRP project, it will take longer to load up. And there's differences in things like shaders you can use and all that other kind of stuff. So we're just going to do the basic 3D. So I am gonna load that up. It'll take whatever a minute, a couple minutes to actually load. The actual particles themselves do need a sprite or a mesh. So by mesh, I mean like 3D object. So like a sphere or something. In that way, we need something to actually render to the screen. I'll show you what it looks like when you have nothing that you're rendering. It just looks like a magenta square. For this very first particle sort of set here, we're going to create a quick material. So I'll show you how to do that, and then apply just a simple sort of UI sprite circle to it. But for the one that we're going to do to reproduce a game, to reproduce a game effect, I do have a sort of smoke type mesh or smoke type sprite that you can use for that. So if my Unity's open, okay. So just the standard basic project, nothing special here. The first thing we want is a material. Whenever you have some sort of object like a particle, there needs to be a material associated with it. That gives all the properties like what's the color of the material, what's the graphic, if it has any. If it's a more complicated material, it might include things like if there's some sort of emission from it, so if it emits light in some way, or if it has other types of maps, like if it has like a metallic map, so some parts are metallic, some parts might not be, that sort of stuff. So we're not going to talk too much about shaders at the moment. We are actually going to talk about shader graph later in the semester, but for now, we need a material that we can apply to the particles that we're going to be emitting. So we're going to create that material first. So I just right-click in my assets sort of region here, say create, and about midway down the list is material. Now I can name it at this point, so I'm just going to call it matte. And it has essentially a standard shader. So all the stuff you see in here for the standard shader are things that we can either add to or change. So the albedo, for example, is the color. There is, you can put a metallic map, a normal map, height map, occlusion map, all kinds of stuff. You can deal with tiling if it's a tileable asset, whatever it might be. We're not going to use the standard shader for this. So Up at the top, for our particle, we're not going to use the standard shader. Up at the, bring a little spotlight thing here. Up at the top in the inspector, it says we have the name is Matt, we have the shader, and it says standard. So if I click on that and open it up, we want particles, standard, unlit. So Joey, to add the material, I just right-clicked in my assets, said create material. And then that gave me a new material, which I could name Matt. So we want to change the shader to, again, particles, standard, unlit. Now, there's a few settings in here that we can sort of mess around with. The rendering mode, we either want fade or transparent. I think for the graphic we're going to use for this, I think fade is going to work for us for the rendering mode. The color mode, we don't have to change. We could have it be color or something, but it's not necessary to change. The last piece of this is to actually pick a graphic. Right now, it's just a white square. So under maps, there's the albedo. I don't want to change the color. I want to actually put a picture as part of the albedo. So I can essentially click on, there's a little circle with a dot in it right next to the albedo name, right before it. If I click on that, it brings up another window, and it wants me to select a texture. You can pretty much use any one of these. I'm going to use the knob right here. It's just one of the textures that should be in there. If you don't see any textures here, that is okay. You can leave it as just the albedo. You'll just have squares instead of circles in there. But you should have some of the UI stuff in here. So if I click knob, now my particle is going to look like this preview that's here in the inspector. So it's going to look like a circle. I could have one with sort of a rounded edges here. There's a few others as well, sort of a diffuse sort of dot. And there's a few other sort of default ones if you wanted to. There's like a checkbox, which isn't showing up there. But I'm just going to keep it with this circle here. So essentially, we're creating a material and throwing an image on it. And when we make our particle system, we're going to display each particle as this image, which is the material. So we're going to give each particle this material, which is just this image. So there is a little bit of setup depending on what you want to display for each one of your particles. All right, so we have a material with whatever image we want. In the hierarchy, I'm going to create an empty. And I can name it whatever I want to, so I can name it like, say, particle 1 or something. So this will be my particle system. I am going to set the position to all 0. The position was not zeroed out when I added it, so I set the position to all 0. Now it's just an empty right now, but remember the particle system is a component, so I can click on the Add Component button, and I already have the filter for it. But if you see just the full sort of list of components, you can just start typing particle, and you'll see particle system. Immediately, the particle system starts playing. So it's emitting particles. They're just magenta squares. If you ever see a magenta square like this in your particle, or potentially a magenta of some other shape, typically that means there's no material assigned to it. That's why we had to create a material, because right now this is not what we want. We want to be able to give it whatever shape we want and eventually change whatever color we want to. There are a ton of options for a particle system, and this might be a little bit small on your monitor. So I'm going to go back to the slides, and I have at least a little bit larger version here. So this is in the inspector when I've selected my game object with the particle system. So there's the default sort of standard stuff that you want to mess around with. That's this stuff here. And then there's a bunch of modules. So the modules are down here. You'll essentially always use 3 of the modules. You're going to use the emission module, the shape module, and the renderer module. Those should be automatically checked, and they should have some settings in them, are already sort of set up. The emission is how the particles are being emitted. The shape is what distribution, how they're sort of being, how they're being emitted and sort of in what direction and that sort of stuff. And the renderer includes the ability to change stuff like the material. So we're going to go to the renderer one here in just a second and add the material that we created. The regular settings that are sort of the default ones that are always active are things like the duration, whether or not it loops, the lifetime of the particles, the speed, the starting speed of the particles, their size, so how big they are, if there's any sort of gravity modifier. So I'm going to mess around with a few of these, and we'll see how it affects what our particles look like as they're being emitted. Also, things like max particles. So 1,000 max particles, for instance, and then we'll look at emission shape and renderer, and then we'll add a couple more. We'll add a couple more of these modules because they do different things, and by messing around with them, we can change the behavior of our actual particle system itself. So these are the sort of most important settings. The whole thing here will get you very interesting particles. Very interesting particle systems. So I'm going to open up renderer. Let's see, Joey. Yeah. So in my material, it should be the tiny little circle with the dot. There's a tiny little circle with a dot before albedo. So if I click on that, it should bring up the ability to select the texture. All right. So when I open my renderer, I open their renderer module. So it's the one at the very end. There's a whole bunch of settings in here. We don't need to change very many of these. The third one down should be material. So over here, there's another one of those circle with a little dot inside of it. If I click on that, it shows me all the materials I have in my project. Some of them are just default materials that should be just part of the project anyway, but I see the one that I created called matte. And essentially you can just double click on it. And now I have my circles being emitted. Now we can start messing around with things like the color of the circles as they're being emitted, for example. That should be the only thing we need to change in renderer. There are lots of other things in here, things that deal with stuff like, I don't know if you have masks, and if you're dealing with any sort of shadow stuff, and if you want trails, your particles to leave trails, what material do the trails look like? So how you want things aligned. So for example, if you look at the render mode, which is the first one, there are a couple different types. We're just using billboard, so it's just there's a billboard facing the camera, and we're just slapping the material right on top of that billboard. But there's other ones as well. There's like mesh and stretched billboard, depending on what your mesh looks like, or sort of stretching your graphic to be the whole thing. So these are things that you can mess around with. You're not going to break anything by messing around with some of these settings. So for render, that's really all we need to do is just change the material. The emission module, so the one that's right underneath all of the sort of standard settings, is how to control how they're being emitted over time. So right now, we have rate over time 10. So every unit of time that goes by, 10 are being emitted. If I increase this, so I did 100, now we have way more particles. They're still only lasting a certain amount of time because we have their start lifetime is only 5, so it's only going through. It's only basically 5 seconds long. Is how long my let me get rid of this. 5 seconds is only how long these particles last. They're all moving at some specific speed. That's determined right now by start speed up in the sort of standard settings. So if I increase the start speed, they start out and move further. This is okay. Maybe I want to slow them down a little bit so they only sort of make sort of a little small thing, or maybe I want them moving fast or something to represent some sort of fire or jet engine or something like that. But for now, let's just I'm just going to put it back to 5 so we get something that sort of looks like this. In the second system that we're going to make today, we are going to use the burst. So for a burst, just think of it literally as a burst of particles. Right now we are looping. So for a burst, it would sort of loop the burst if we added one of those in, but we will use that for the second version. So right now, sort of 100, that's fine for rate over time. If I could slow it down, I could speed it up, that sort of thing. So I'm going to close emission, and I'm going to look at shape. Now, what you can probably barely see if you're looking at the shape is there's actually this sort of bluish shape here. It kind of looks like a cone. That's because the shape of our emission zone is a cone. So under shape, it says shape, we have cone selected. If I change this to something else, like say a box, there's our box shape. So we have a little box here, a little sort of 3D cube, and it's emitting from that. I could change this to a circle. Now it's emitting from a circle. This isn't a sphere, it's just a 2D circle. So they're all along a 2D plane here. We can, of course, rotate the shape as well. So there's some rotation options and stuff in the shape module. So if I wanted to rotate, let's say I wanted to rotate about the X, and I put in 90 degrees, now I'm looking at it like this. And right now it's just emitting in any direction along that circle. There are settings for all of these shapes. So for example, maybe I don't want to go along the entire shape. So maybe I only want a 60-degree arc. So even though it's a circle shape, I can change the arc in sort of how it's emitting. So there's tons and tons of settings for how you want to shape these things. In the second more complicated one that we do today, we're going to use a hemisphere and a circle to make a specific particle effect. So lots of stuff you can do with the shapes, and again, you just mess around with them. There's donut shapes. So it's going to give you more of sort of a 3D-ish sort of we had a circle 2D one. This gives you a little bit more 3D behavior, and then there's ways to change settings on the donuts. You can emit from meshes as well. So if I had something that I modeled in Blender, for instance, I can have it emit directly from a mesh. So that's an easy one. There's other ones as well, things like rectangles. So this is shooting out the face of the rectangle, for instance. So there's definitely lots of them. I think I'll just keep it with the cone for now, and I'm going to rotate this back so that it's sort of pointing away from the camera. So there's our cone shape, and it's going from the back of the cone, and there's a few settings here. You can change the radii and stuff like that of the actual cone itself. But what this allows for the cone is that the velocity that these particles get can be anywhere where it's spawning, so that it's inside of this cone region and being shot out of the cone region. So those are the standard modules that you're going to want to mess with. Renderer to get the material, the emission to change how they're actually spawning in terms of the amount that are spawned, and the shape to determine how they're spawning is sort of what direction they're pointed, and whether or not they're sort of coming from an actual mesh you've created or some other type of surface, like a sphere, for instance. A sphere will cause stuff to go out in all directions. So there's lots of fun settings to mess around with here, depending on what you want. Now, this isn't very interesting in terms of a particle system. Even if I had some more interesting graphic here, it's not that great. So there's a whole bunch of other modules that you can activate to do interesting things. So I'm going to look at this color over lifetime module. If I check this, then it'll activate it, but nothing changed. That's because I need to click on the actual sort of color of the bar there. This brings up a gradient editor. The top handles are effectively the transparency. The alpha is what it is. The bottom handles are the color. So if I click on one of those handles and I change the color to something, here's my gradient. So bring the gradient back up. So we're going from like a pure red color, and it's blending over the course of the gradient to white. Notice that the mode is blend. It's not fixed. It's blend. So we're going to blend all the way through. Kevin, it's not popping up. Check to make sure that it's that you've checked the color over lifetime. so that it is checked. And then it should come up just by clicking on the color bar. If not, I can see about taking a look at that after we get finished and see if there's something else happening. The top ones are alpha. So if I click on one of the alpha ones here, notice it says alpha 255. That's totally opaque. So if I drop this down, say to 0, then we're going to go from totally opaque, we're going to go from red to white, but as we go towards the white, we start to disappear. It starts to become transparent. Oftentimes in particle systems, the particles either change their size to go away, so they either, whatever size they are, they shrink down to nothing, or they become transparent and disappear. So that's exactly what we have here. And we could add more handles in here. So I could add another handle down here for the color, and I can change this color to a purple. And so now I go from a red to a purple to a white. I could add more handles up here at the top. So I'm just clicking right above or right below the little color bar. And maybe I want this to be fully transparent until after the purple. So now I get my red to purple to white, but also transparent. So that's how you mess around with color over lifetime. And this will be for whatever the lifetime is. It's from when the particle is created on the left to when the particle disappears or would normally sort of despawn on the right. So if I change in the sort of standard settings, if I change the lifetime now to 10, it still keeps that same look, except now the particles last longer, so the gradient pieces last longer. It's now red for longer than it was before, and purple, and then fades out. So it directly corresponds to that lifetime. So I'll go back to 5 here so we can get the whole thing sort of easily in here. So color over lifetime, one of the most useful ones, because for something like a fire, you probably want it maybe close to the source. Maybe you want it a little bit bluish, and then it changes to sort of a orangey red and maybe a yellow or something, or maybe something darker at the end. So being able to change the gradient and the opacity like that is one of the most useful aspects here for your particle system. I want to show you size over lifetime as well. So size over lifetime, make sure to check that module, and we'll open it up. It does have some default stuff. So as soon as I checked that module, notice they're now really small at the beginning, and then they get larger as we go through the lifetime. That's because of a graph. So just like the color over lifetime had the color I could click on, I can click on this little graph thing here. It should pop up below. So there's this little sort of view area here in the inspector. It should pop up down there. If it's real small, or it's not, or it doesn't look like it's there at all, you should still be able to click and drag on it to bring it up. So this is the size over lifetime. It starts at 0 and it goes up to 1. So 1 is your default size. That's your size that you've determined up here in sort of the standard settings. If I want to start at 1 like this, and if I want to add another handle, I just click on the curve. Just double click on the curve. I can do something like this. So you can see now it starts at a normal size, gets small, and then gets large again. So the curve is showing over time, over the lifetime, how is this changing size. So if I wanted it to disappear, I could take the handle here at the very end, drop it down to essentially 0. Maybe move this one around. If you want to delete them, you can always delete the key. I just right-clicked on it. And I can do something like this. You may have to mess around with some of the handles. It could take a little bit of getting used to for exactly how the curves here function. But if I wanted it to completely disappear, I could do something like this. So now not only do they fade out, they get smaller over time as well. So it sort of starts out at the normal size and then drops down over time. And at the bottom of this little graph editor, there are some sort of standard graphs as well. So something like this. And you can just click on them to automatically set it. So some standard useful ones, but of course you can manipulate it as much as you want. So being able to change the size is also really important for most particle systems, size over lifetime. This looks pretty uniform at the moment. Everybody's moving the same speed, all that kind of stuff. There are a few things to deal with velocity. So for example, velocity over lifetime, which is right below shape, if I click on that, there's a whole bunch of options here. There's linear, orbital, offset, radial, all that kind of stuff. So the best thing to do is to just have a system going and play with some of these. See what happens when you start messing with these values. So here, it's definitely the sort of radial value is causing the whole thing to spread out more. Increase it even more. I get a lot more spread for the radial value. So maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I want a little more sort of linear over time. Here we go. So I'm moving now more in the X. So this, you can do individual axes as well to change exactly how it's sort of spitting them out. One thing that I want to point out with pretty much all of these settings, especially the ones that look like they can just take a single value. Over here on the right, there's a little drop-down arrow. If I click on that, constant, curve, random between two constants, and random between two curves. This is super useful. So here, if I say random between two constants, it now shows two XYZ values. So if I put in something like -5 and 5 for X, now I get something that's a lot more spread in the X direction. Because it's picking for each particle, it's picking an extra velocity between -5 and 5 in the X direction, which gives me a lot more spread like this. And I can do that for any of the axes, for instance. We're going to use the rotation over lifetime in a second when we make our a little bit more complicated one. But for all of these values, they all have that. So for start speed, for instance, I could say random between two constants, and I could say between 1 and 10. So now some particles are disappearing at the beginning because they're moving real slow, so they don't get very far, whereas some of the particles randomly are moving faster, so they make it further. So that's how you add a little bit of randomness into your particle systems, using either between two constants or between two curves. Two curves just uses that same curve editor. It's just you're giving a range between the two curves. So let me show you that real quick. If I say random between two curves for the speed, and I make sure to click on it here so it's brought up, the random between two curves will be the values in this shaded section. So I essentially have two curves that I can mess with so that any value can be selected over lifetime between these two curves. So we're getting a ton of particles here being created. I think that's why it's doing the little thing here. Actually, this should be over lifetime. So I guess they start out slow and then they really speed up. We might be reaching the max particles. It looks like we're only at 500. So you can get some really interesting effects here by messing around with some of these settings. So this is giving us our start speed between two curves for our particles. So go back to between two constants. Here we got the 1 and the 10. So it's worth messing around with these because you can get some really cool stuff happening. Let's see if there is another interesting one here. There's a few others, things like forces over lifetime. So if you have something like another kind of force or something like wind or something, you can wind gusts or something that happens over time. You can simulate that with like force over lifetime and stuff. Right now, gravity is set to 0. So there's a gravity modifier in the top set of settings. If I change this to like 1, then we start to see something where gravity is pulling these guys down as they go through their lifetime. And of course, you can change that to whatever you want per particle system. So here it's very small, 0.1, and the other one there was much more. Here's like 10. So you get a really sort of high gravity thing. So if I was making some sort of sparking thing, I'd probably add a little bit of gravity, so some of the sparks would sort of go up and then fall back down. And of course, the shader on them or the graphic on them would probably be a little line or something. And whatever, I'd add some post-processing to make them glow or something like that, and then have them sort of burst out. So not a constant flow, but sort of a burst every once in a while, sort of bursting. So there's a lot of different settings to mess with, but most of them work in this exact same way. If you want collision, so if you want these particles to collide with other things in your scene, there is a collision collision module as well. So you can mess with them. Typically, turning collision on, it will be good enough for most cases, but you can add things like bounce in there as well if you want them to sort of bounce off of something that they hit. And this sort of messes with the box collider rigid body type stuff. So you have to have colliders on your objects that you want this to interact with. It's like visualize bounds. So there's the collider for each one of these particles. And when I check to visualize bounds, it doesn't have any impact on the actual colliders themselves, but it lets you see where they are. So if we pause this, we can actually go in and check what these are. And it looks like they're using spheres for these particular ones. So you can do collision with these in the GPU particles, in the visual effects graph. That's much more difficult to do. It's not something you can just add a collision module and you're done, because the particles in there are on the GPU, they would have to communicate to the CPU, whereas these ones are already on the CPU where all of your other game logic and stuff is, so it's very easy for them to interact. So you can add colliders to them, you can add triggers to them and stuff too, but we're not going to go over those for now. You can add extra noise and stuff in there as well if you want to change sort of their motion or things like that. So there's lots of fun stuff to do. The biggest thing here is to just mess around with the settings. See what these certain settings do. Watch a few other tutorials where they look like they do something interesting that you might want to mess with. See what the settings are. See how they mess with the color by speed, for instance. If you have some particles moving faster, maybe they should be a different color, for example. So there's modules that deal with that. So sort of as far as the basic particle system goes for this little basic thing that we created, what questions do you guys have about this? So we do one a little bit more complicated here in just a second. It's going to have a couple of different components to it.
So those particles, they look 2D. Are they 2D or 3D?
Yeah, so these are just 2D. So these are just billboard. So essentially we're just taking that little 2D graphic, that little 2D circle thing I found, and throwing on a billboard thing that just slaps it on. It's always going to face the camera. There's ways to change that, but it does always face the camera. And most particle systems that you're going to see in games, they are sort of like this, where it's just a billboard because it's easy to render. You don't have to render any sort of complex geometry stuff. But with the renderer here, you can render meshes. So if you go to mesh mode here, then you can choose what mesh is actually rendered. Here, it looks a little strange because I'm rendering the material on a cube. So if I go back to like default diffuse, now I'm spitting out a bunch of cubes. So you can definitely do meshes. Yep.
But it does the collision 3D automatically, right? Even though it's like 2D, it has like the 3D collision.
Yeah, so it'll sort of those ones that I was showing will sort of bounce like balls on the based on the collision stuff. And I think you can probably define that depending on what you use for like a mesh. You can most likely define what the collision is going to be like, particularly on a mesh, and it may default to like a mesh collider on those if you use a mesh for your collision. Yeah, these will sort of bounce like balls. I think you can set so the render alignment here. I say view, so that's why it's always going to be they're always going to be facing the camera. But if you change it to something else, if we say velocity, then they're all facing the direction that they're actually moving. So they sort of in this case, I guess it's negative. Might have to flip it. I think that's what the flip is for here. But yes, they are basically, you can change what their facing is on these. If we made the material, I think we make the material double-sided, and then it'll show on both sides. But there's a bunch of settings you can mess with. But you can have them facing a different direction. But view is sort of the typical one. All right, Joey, we can definitely take a look at that potentially after we finish up today and see if there's some issue color-wise. It might be It might be related to the material. I'm not entirely sure. All right, so I'm just going to disable this one. So I'm just going to click the check mark next to the name of the object in the inspector. And we're going to create a couple more, but I'm going to show you sort of what this looks like. So in the slides, I have a whole bunch of the sort of individual pieces of this and stuff like this. Just showing color over lifetime and emission and all that kind of stuff. So it just shows you some of these blown up, and you can certainly come back and take a look at the slides. And so this is sort of something that we sort of come up with. Have these circles, they sort of move around and do whatever. Here I had some different colors on this one. So even though it's a simple system, it uses a whole bunch of the features that can be used to make a lot more complicated systems. We're going to make something that looks like this. So we're going to have a more complicated one. I did put a simple sprite. So let me go to the Blackboard here. Along with the lecture slides, I did create this little smoke PNG. So it kind of looks like the smoke that you saw there in the image. We're going to do things like rotate it and change the color and all that kind of stuff. Most of the time, your particles will just be white, because you can change the color yourself in the actual settings for the particle system. So if you decide you want to make particles like sparkles or something, you might have a tiny little star-looking thing, and it's just going to be white because you'll change the color later on. So that's why my smoke, my outline here is white. If we want it darker, lighter, whatever, we can mess around with that. But you can certainly download this. I will show you how to bring it in to Unity. But for now, you can just take this guy here, download it to whatever your downloads folder or whatever, and then get ready to bring it in. So I did add that to the lecture 4A section today. This image, this sort of effect here, should be reminiscent from something like this. So this is Legend of Zelda Wind Waker from GameCube. I think I played it on GameCube, and I think I also got it, I don't know, on Wii or something. Wind Waker had explosions like this for sometimes when enemies died and when like bombs exploded and stuff. So it had these little sort of smoke looking particles, like the one that the sort of reminiscence of the one I created for you. And it would typically have a central explosion, as well as a sort of circular explosion that sort of came out along the ground. It also had some of these extra pieces that sort of blew out as well. We're not going to make those, but I'll point out a couple places that you could look to think about creating them if you wanted to. So we're going to make sort of that feature, and it's worth looking at games and saying, all right, how could they have made that effect? When you're playing games where you're like casting a magic spell and you see a bunch of like lines and sparkles and stuff happen, it's just a particle effect. So if you can figure out maybe what the particle graphic looked like, it's just a matter of going in and choosing the appropriate shape and emission and any sort of burst things that happen and the color over time and the size over time. It's just a matter of changing a bunch of those properties. One of the things that, if you look closely at this, that you might note is we've got a couple of different graphics in here. So this one here is definitely different than the one next to it. We're not going to do that. We're just going to use one particular graphic, but I'll mention a couple things about how you can do it. It's not built in at the moment to be able to do something like that, at least not as easy as you might want it to be. But otherwise, we see that there's different rotations on these different particles. They look like they're probably different sizes. They're definitely different colors, and if you sort of watched a video of this, the colors do change over time as well. So it's a bunch of those features that we looked at, just put together in a slightly different way. So we're going to start with that central explosion. And I'm not going to spend too much time tweaking this. This is something that you can tweak indefinitely. One of those things that will sort of never be finished. You'd be like, oh, I wish it would sort of go a little bit faster at the beginning and then really slow down. And maybe you tweak it a bunch, and it's easy to spend hours tweaking these things. So let's say you downloaded your particle, or that PNG. So I have it here. It's in a different folder, but I do have it here, the Smoke 1 PNG. All you got to do is have Unity up and your folder, and you can just take the PNG and you can just drag it right into the assets. And it shows up here. We're not going to change a whole lot here. We're going to leave the actual image as is. I do have a whole lecture on importing 2D and 3D assets and what a bunch of these settings do, and when it's a good time to change them from the default when you bring in an image like this. But we're just going to leave this one as is. We're going to make the material still, but for the actual image that gets brought in, we're not going to worry about it. So again, you can just take the PNG from whatever folder and you can drag it in. That's probably the easiest way to do it. You should be able to open other stuff, import new asset, and then you can go find the image if you want to. But typically, I just drag stuff in. We need a material based off of this image because this is just the actual sort of 2D texture. So I need a material just like we needed a material for the actual circle thing that I used there. So I'm going to create a material, and I'm going to call this one my smoke mat. I need to change the shader. I don't want the standard shader. I want the particles standard unlit. I'm going to click on the little circle the circle with the dot next to albedo and bring in my smoke. Right now, it will actually display the black. So if I made a particle system right now, it would display the black border around this. So that's why I want to go to something like transparent in the rendering mode. And I'll keep the rest of the stuff the same. So I need transparent rendering mode because this does have a transparent background. Otherwise, color mode, I can sort of show you what some of these do a little bit later once we have it ready to go. But this is what you should see down on the little preview thing. No black border around it, just the actual sort of smoke looking thing. So that's our material. So now we can make a particle system. So I'm going to create an empty game object. This time I'm going to call it, maybe I'll call it like center explosion. I'm going to add the component particle system. Right now I just have the, actually let me move this to 0, 0, 0. There we go. Right now I just have the sort of the billboard stuff. And I'm going to change the renderer to my smoke mat. So now I have my little smoke particles coming out. So Joey importing the image is just wherever it's located on your computer, you can just click on it and drag it in. And you should see a little sort of plus sign after you drag it in over the assets area, and it'll bring in the image. There's other ways you can do as well. You should be able to say import asset, and then you should be able to go to wherever you actually downloaded it to and open it that way as well. But again, typically I just use it, I just click and drag, especially for small stuff. This isn't much of an explosion. So let's change the shape to be a hemisphere. Now it's rotated. So I need to figure out, okay, this is probably, which way do I want to rotate this? I want to rotate this, I think, around the X, and we go like, I think, -90. So I just had to rotate it. There's one of the rotation options here in the shape. So I have a hemisphere that sort of makes sense for an explosion. They can sort of explode out, and I want to do it sort of an upward direction. You could use a sphere here, but you're also getting it to go down. So if this is something that's meant to explode on the surface of whatever your terrain or something, then you don't necessarily need to render those particles that are going down below your terrain. So a hemisphere can work. Again, a sphere can work. It's not a big deal. To actually have an explosion, we need to look at the emission module. I'm going to take the rate over time, and I'm going to put that to 0. So nothing spawning. Because I want a burst. So to add a burst, right now it says list is empty. So I'm going to click the plus sign. And there's a few things that pop up here. The reason why this looks like it's sort of exploding more than once is because I have looping turned on. And I'm going to keep looping on so we can sort of see how this works see each one without having to click anything to play it again or something like that. So this will only burst once if I turn looping off, which is what we want. If we have some sort of bomb or something and it explodes, we want to have looping turned off so that it happens one time and that's it. But for visualization, for me to figure out if this is looking the way I want, I'm going to keep looping on for now. So my burst, I can include the count, or I can increase the count. So I can be like, maybe I want 100. Maybe I want 200. However many sort of makes sense for a burst. Now it doesn't look like a sort of a bursty explosion at the moment, but it's getting a lot closer. We probably want the lifetime to be shorter. So I might take the lifetime maybe to 2 seconds, so it's not quite as long. You could increase the speed as well to make them sort of faster. The main way I'm going to slow everything down here, especially sort of to be faster at the beginning and then slower as it gets towards the end, is I'm going to use this module limit velocity over lifetime. And I'm going to put some drag on here. So if I change the drag to say 1, watch what happens. It looks a little better. So it starts out a little faster, and then it slows down because there's drag. They're slowing down based on the two check marks underneath are size and velocity. So the faster they're going, the more drag they're going to get, and their size as well, which all of them are the same size here, so they're all getting sort of affected by drag the same way. So that is looking a little better for sort of a central explosion. I can increase the starting speed of this if I wanted to, maybe if I wanted to have it be a little bit bigger or something. Again, there's infinite amounts of stuff you can do here. There's tons of messing with these settings. I just want to get sort of somewhere close to looking like a decent explosion. So limit velocity over lifetime can be quite useful. You can, of course, not just put a single value in, but you could make it random if you want to, random between two constants or random between two curves. The random ones are going to be useful for adding that little bit of randomness to whatever particle system you're using. I'm not going to bother with them too much right now, but they can enhance the effect quite a bit. Now, all of them, if we pause here, all of them are oriented the same angle. So you just see a whole bunch of these little guys sort of oriented the same way. There's also a rotation over lifetime module. By activating it, notice they've all rotated by 45 degrees. That's not what I want. I don't want them to all be rotated the same. I want it to be somewhat random. So this is one of the places, probably the only place today, that we're going to use, for this one anyway, that we're going to use random between two constants. So if I put in something like negative 45 to positive 45, then somewhere in between, that's where their angle is going to be. And I can increase this. I could say something like negative 180 to 180. So now I have all different directions. It depends on what you want. I mean, this overall looks fine, but maybe I want it to be a little bit less. So maybe negative 90 to 90, for instance. Whatever you want it to look like. But that's our rotation over lifetime. So it's just you're given an angular velocity. This is what happens over their lifetime. So they're given some velocity. So if I actually play this again, they're going to continue to be rotating. So if I want that faster or slower, I can edit these values, but they will rotate over their lifetime now, which is essentially what I want. I want the smoke to sort of rotate a little bit as they move out. Let's mess with the color over lifetime as well. Now, here you can really do whatever you want. As an example, I have some gradients that I've already sort of preset. So if I have something like this, see that it sort of starts sort of a red. It actually starts as sort of a dark blue, but it's not sort of showing very well here. And then it goes to this yellow and it fades. Joey, yeah, one more time.
How do you get those colors in there? That was like the issue I was having. I only had like white and black. So how do you like put those colors?
That was issue on the circle one.
Yeah.
On the circle one as well. So make sure you have color over lifetime. Make sure you throw in. Let's see. Make sure you have the handles here, so you can just click right below and it'll create the handle. Were you able to get to the gradient editor at all, Joey?
Yes.
So yeah, being able to add the little handles in here, then you can click on the color here to be able to change stuff. The other one, the top version is just the alpha. So that'll be the transparency. If you add in one of these that you want to delete, you can just click on it and then press delete on the keyboard. If the color is not showing up, at all, and then that likely has something to do with the shader. So if I have something like this, So if I come back over here and I change this to, I think, I don't know if I changed some of these around. Yeah, this one's not showing anything. There we go. So you get some weird stuff here once you start messing around with the shader. This. So you can start to get some weird things there.
What did you have for the start lifetime and start speed?
So let's go here. So start lifetime, I have 2, so they should last 2 seconds, and the start speed here was 5. So Joey, could be something with maybe the shader. This, the actual image itself, you shouldn't have to mess with at all. So the shader would be the only sort of potentially strange thing that that one of the settings might be kind of weird. I usually just typically leave it at multiply and make sure to change it to either fade or transparent. There is some differences between them. Cutout, for example, doesn't have any transparency. And if you change some of these to other things like subtractive, you start to potentially get some weirdness with the actual with the actual shader. But we can definitely take a look at it if you can't quite get the colors the way you want.
What kind of shader did you create for this one? Just
So these are using the standard unlit. So particles, standard unlit. So if I click on the drop down here, I say particles, standard unlit. The regular surface shader ones can be affected by lights. So if you don't want to worry about it being affected by lights, you just use the unlit one.
So you right click the image and then you created like shade, and then you press shader and then
no. So you do create material. And then once you have the material up, then you change the shader to the particle standard unlit.
Okay.
And then for the map, for the albedo map, that's when I click on the little circle thing and I'm able to pick my image, my smoke 1 image. We will talk about creating shaders, but not until a little bit later on this semester. Because you can do some really cool stuff with shaders. Shaders are pretty sweet. I do not know shader language, so I've just been using the shader graph in Unity, which is what we'll talk about. There may end up being a warning at some point if you start changing settings. You don't necessarily have to worry about it for this case. Okay, so let's say that's what we want for the explosion. So I don't know. We could select some other. We could create some other gradient for this. Again, some of the presets that I have here are not really explosion necessary, but explosion useful. But they are sort of at least hopefully somewhat decent looking. So let's create the ring. That little sort of ring that follows along the ground. So right now you can probably imagine how that's going to look. So I'm going to create another empty, and I'm going to call this ring. And I'm going to add the particle system to it. And like we've been doing in the renderer, I'm going to add my smoke material to it. But this time for the shape, I'm going to use the circle. Now it's not quite rotated right, and it's in the wrong place, so I'm going to zero it out. So it's obviously not rotated correctly, so I should go into the shape module and make sure, I think here I just need to rotate it in 90 degrees in the X. So, and I'm leaving the explosion particles out here so I can sort of see what they look like. If you want them to play at the same time, you can actually take the ring object and make it a child of the center explosion. Then if I click on the center explosion, I will see both of them go. So it depends on what you want. So this gives me in sort of that 2D plane, which is what I want. I want these to sort of move along the ground, presuming it's flat on the ground. Emission-wise, actually, I'm clicked on the center explosion still, so I'm going to go to the ring. Emission-wise, I want the rate over time to be 0, and I want to make that burst, just like I did before. And maybe we'll have like 100 in the burst or something. So something like that. So now it's looking a little better. Even though we haven't done anything with color, and we haven't messed with the lifetime at all, it's actually not looking too bad. So up in the sort of standard settings, I'm going to change the lifetime. Maybe I want it to last a little bit less time than the explosion does. So I put 1.7 seconds, so it should sort of disappear before the explosion does. And on our limit velocity over lifetime, I'm just going to put drag on here again. And maybe, I don't know, maybe a little less drag, maybe like 0.5 for the drag. So it sort of goes out a little bit farther. And that's this, again, these are things that you just go and mess with. Color over lifetime, probably going to be a useful one. Maybe I'll pick one of these other gradients that I had already created. So something like that. And let's go with, let's do the rotation over lifetime. So we'll give it some angular velocity like we had for the other ones. So I'll say random between two constants, and I'll say negative 45 to 45. So we get a little bit of rotation in there for those guys. And I'm going to do the size over lifetime. So I'm going to do the size over lifetime. And let's go in and mess with this. Maybe I want them to get really small, or I want them to basically disappear. So I'm going to bring the right-hand side down, the left-hand side up. I'll mess with the handles here a little bit. So that at the very end of their life, they basically disappear. They get really small rather than just sort of fading out. They get real small. They get real small. Maybe a little bit too fast. So maybe I'll move this a little bit more. So again, the tweaking on this is an infinite amount of stuff you can do. For the gradient that I have here on the actual center explosion, I'm going to click back on the center explosion, and I'm going to make sure my gradient here goes to 0. So those are just going to fade out. Actually, the fade on that doesn't look too good. So it's probably related to the color mode. So I'm going to say that might be better. I think it's related to how I'm doing the color stuff here. So if I do, say, fade like this, let's see how this one looks. Again, there's lots of settings that you can mess around with. Yeah, I think the fade looks better on the actual material. So again, it depends on what you're trying to go for. So Kevin, most of the time, if you're just in the viewport like this, it's usually if I have something like this, it's usually just whichever one you're clicked on. That's the one that'll play. If you want them to play together, you can make the ring a child of the center explosion. Or if we go into play mode, then both of them should play at the same time. But of course, in play mode, if you start messing with the values over here, they're just going to go back to their previous values after you leave play mode. So that's why I liked having the looping on, for instance. But here it is in play mode. So this looks okay. The ring might need more particles or something, but again, this is stuff that you just go and mess with to your heart's content until you get it to look like what you want it to look like. The thing about the ring is it's actually not going to work the way you want it to. If I move the ring object, so right now I'm selected on the ring. If I move this ring object closer to the camera, so my camera's right here, I'm going to move the ring object closer. And I go into play mode. Did you catch what happened? The ring particles are in front of my explosion particles here. And this will happen even if they overlap. If they're in the exact same location, you'll still get situations like this. That's not what we want. That does not look good at all. These particles are further away from the camera. The ones in the ring that are behind, that should be behind the sort of explosion piece, the central explosion, they should be behind the central explosion. They're further from the camera. But that's not how Unity does the rendering of the particle systems. Whatever particle system itself, whichever one is closer to the camera, all of those particles will be rendered on top of anything that's behind, any particle system that is behind. So as we have it set right now, the ring is in front of the actual central explosion. And even if I get them really close together, it doesn't matter. It's still going to have that problem. It looks like this camera angle, it's mostly okay, but you will, yeah. So here it looks like it's reversed what it's been doing. Notice that the central explosion is in front of the ones that are coming out. So these are sort of a weird sort of artifact that you end up getting. The way to fix this is to have multiple rings. So I'm going to take my ring object and make sure it's a child of my central explosion so I can see them both at the same time. And I'm going to take the ring itself and I'm just going to move it a little bit out like this. And instead of having it explode in the entire circle, I'm going to take my shape and I'm going to condense or shrink this down to just a 60-degree angle. So now it's just shooting out like that. But I moved it closer to the camera, so I'm going to rotate this, I think it's in the Y, by 60, maybe a little bit more, something like 90, something like this. So now it's only shooting out in this direction. I may need to adjust the number of particles. 100 particles might be too much for that region, so maybe I'll put it down to 30. Now I'm going to duplicate this. So I'm going to click on my ring object and say duplicate. Now I have a second one there. I'm going to move that one just slightly so it's not right on top of the other one. And in the shape, I'm going to rotate it by another 60 degrees. That would put it at 150. So now I can see that I'm starting to create the full circle. And let's see, let's make sure that this one here is going. Let's check that one again for the shape here. Yeah, it should be okay. There we go. I don't know.
Professor, how did you get it to only go in a certain direction? Sorry.
So you change in the shape, you change the arc to whatever the arc needs to be, and then you have to rotate the object so that the arc is pointed in the right direction. So you can imagine adding a few more of these so that you have the full ring, but with our camera in play mode, they will always properly be in front. In this case, my camera is sort of adjusted so it's facing. So I adjusted the particles so they're facing the camera. So they will always properly be in front. But if I rotate the camera around, so I'll do that. Actually, we can probably just see it this way here. If I rotate around like this, and we play, they're behind here. So by having a smaller set of particle systems like this, we can get around that issue that was sort of the particles not drawing in sort of the appropriate location. So if you do run across that with sort of a multi-particle system effect like this, then you may have to do something like this. If it's just a single particle system, it's fine. Everything works like normal. But if you're using a particle system that has more than sort of one particle system to it, an effect that has more than one particle system, then you're likely going to have to mess around with doing something like this, particularly with sort of a ring explosion. This system here is not this probably isn't where I'd stop with this. I'd go on and make changes to more settings and maybe make the central explosion a little more compact, a little tighter or something. Maybe have those particles shrink too as they fade out. But the point here is that you can keep adding more and more to this. You can mess with the settings, add more types of particle systems. For example, I mentioned that you could have those little sort of extra little fireball things that come out. There is a module here called sub-emitters. And if you turn it on, you can add another particle system to where each one of the particles, say on birth or on death, trigger another particle system to run. So I could add another particle system in there where it spews out a couple of particles with gravity, and then each one of those has a sub-emitter that emits a trail of smoke. So you can sort of keep layering these things on one another to make much more complicated effects. So sub-emitters can be quite useful especially for things like more interesting trails and sort of triggering certain things to happen when certain particles either die or collide with something or get birthed or something like that. So there's still lots of cool stuff you can do with just with a single particle system. But here, just a composite of a couple of particle systems that we had to mess around with to get sort of a decent looking explosion. Again, I would add more rings so that we get a full sort of circle of rings around it, and then it would probably be ready to go if I had all the settings what I wanted. hopefully this was a sort of a decent look at the particle system. We're only going to do the one lecture on it on the standard particle system, on the CPU particle system. Again, next time is the GPU particle system. It's very different in the way that you set everything up, but it can be very powerful because you can have potentially millions of particles and do a lot of cool stuff with it. There's tons of tutorials online for creating different effects, from other video games to just sort of decent stuff. There's a lot of stuff there about like fire and things, because that's a very common one. You want to create a little sort of flickering flame with some smoke or something. There's tons of them that sort of deal with that. And any of them that use the standard Unity particle system, they're essentially just modifying these settings and potentially choosing a sort of simple graphic to use on them. So that is all for today. I don't have anything else. So next time we'll look at the Unity visual effects graph. On Thursday, remember that your game design document is due for the unconventional weapon. Again, you don't have to make the game. You just have to come up with something that maybe sounds interesting that you could potentially do in sort of a 4-day thing. And my plan was to make sure that sort of everybody could see everybody else's. So I may put out a little poll on that in case folks don't want to do that. Joey, it should be for the group. So the group your group can get together, come up with a few ideas, throw them into a sort of a game design document like the Volcano Island one, and get in there. So I think I said it for Thursday, but whatever the date says in Blackboard, Gabe. Yeah, so that's basically it for today. So okay, sure, Friday. Yeah, I may have made it Friday. Yeah, whatever the date says in Blackboard, I forgot what I put in there. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Thursday for visual effects graph. Joey, if you still had an issue, I can definitely help you with that. There is also that. Let Them Dare this weekend, which I think I might be able to do. So I may not be able to do something for the full 48 hours, but that is coming up, and that's usually a fun time. So if I do something for it, I will definitely post in Slack the link to actually play it in the browser, so you can mess around with it if I do end up making something. Jared, it should be set up as a group submit. So if one person submits it, it should show up as submitted for everyone. But that's it. So have a good day. If other folks have questions, you can definitely stick around.
Have a good one, Professor.
So yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. So, Professor, I was just if I could share my screen, I just never got like the color palette or anything. Like I can see color and I can see everything else, but
with the settings here. Okay, you should be able to share.
Awesome. So for color over